Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Stewart, and I'm participating in a bit of a conversation and I suppose an interview with the poet and student of my fellow student of English literature, Geoff Nilson, who is graciously interviewing me about my book, In Singing He Composed a Song.
I'm very grateful to you, Jeremy, to ask me to do this. I've been reading your work for a few years now, and you've given me some opportunities as a writer as well through your journal, Dreamland. And so when you asked me to do this, I was super excited. So I'm, like you said, I'm a poet and a critic and a student at SFU in Burnaby. I'm working on my MA. I specialize in avant-garde poetry and poetics with an interest in CanLit and art history. And I've been working on a project around value theory and the small press. And my most recent article was published in the fall of last year with Canadian Literature, which was on the poetry of Stephen Colas. A poet that is also SFU based, and I encourage people to check out. Yeah, I guess we just get right into some of these questions I have about your book, about all your books actually. Just thinking directly about in your most recent book, in Singing He Composed a Song. A lot of your work is based in this this mythology of the northern town, and I've been thinking a lot about the Prince George stories that I've heard growing up. My family's from there, and shout out to Mr. PG, of course. And there's a lot of PG stories in your books, whether they're images from the city or whether it's just a sense of that sort of northern industrial sort of nature of the town. So you've also kind of created a lot of moments in the city's history yourself with some of the things that you've done with your music festival, with the piano drop. And one of my favorite things was, I think for one of the festivals, you did a performance on a sand bluff above the river, if I remember correctly. So can you say a few words about this this connection to Prince George and maybe some of the mythology of the northern town that's kind of permeating your writing?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jeff. And also, I'm just going to interrupt myself for a moment to just say how excited I am to be speaking with you about all this, and how much I appreciate you doing this interview. I definitely have been grateful to publish your work in Dreamland magazine and read it and sort of follow along with it over time. And of course, not long ago, you sent me a nice box of chapbooks and broadsides and wonderful stuff. And yeah, so I'm very grateful. Thank you. And of course, it's also been very generous of you, the time that you've spent with my work, and I appreciate that. As far as the northern mythology goes, so for anybody here who's watching the video who's not familiar with Prince George, of course, it's a town it's in the central interior of British Columbia, but because it's north of so much of the population of British Columbia, it is, I would say, northern. And what counts as northern, of course, is a hot topic that gets debated among people, especially as you go farther north in BC. They'll tell you that their place is north and that places south of them that claim to be north are not really. So that's just a little bit of context for people. And I grew up there. I lived there. Well, I lived there for 35 years, actually. And I never really planned to leave, but things have worked out as they have. And it's been great. It was a great place to grow up. There are many mythologies, competing mythologies of Prince George and of northern BC, and they sort of range in the kind of ways they're rooted, from just being being things that are obvious and therefore also often things that are cliches, to being things that are really, you can only experience them from the point of view of actually spending a prolonged period of time there. And I would just give an example of that one. Well, this is sort of a mixed one. When I think about the mythology of it, I think about how Prince George is actually closer to Vancouver than White Rock is, because it's easier to get people to go from Vancouver to Prince George in a way than it is to go from Vancouver to White Rock. That's funny to me because I live in White Rock now. But the other thing about it is an important mythology that I think I've put forward in my work about Prince George is that it's people who come from a really big city will often imagine it or not imagine it. If they think of it at all, they will think of it as being similar to suburbs that they know, rural places that are closer to their own home place. But actually Prince George is a real city, and it's a capital city. It's just a very small capital city of a very large and a region that is relatively empty of people. So I think that that's something I want to get across. And if I try to get closer to where that desire is coming from, I think that I have wanted to create mythologies of Prince George that would complicate and problematize mythologies of it that seem to be less from its own point of view. I wanted it to be real, but a marginalized place is never quite as real somehow, because the voices that are saying what it is from outside are louder. There are more of them.
Yeah, and you definitely see those or hear those multiple voices across the work, kind of coming in here and there. I think probably more in the poetry in Hidden City and in Flood Basement, that you see the kind of the unbodied voices coming up in different parts, and you're not quite sure, is this the poetic voice, or is this maybe something overheard on the street? In you have the same sort of overlappingness of voices in the characters of the most recent book. How do you approach characterization in this book compared to some of your poetry? There's an effort to really narrativize and to make these characters more real than in your poetic works. How did you tackle that this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly in Flood Basement, there are characters and there are even plots. I was thinking about this because of actually some of the questions that you had sent me, asking about the necessity of dealing with characterization and plot differently in this book. And I think it has to do with the sort of scale and scope of the story that I wanted to tell, because anecdote is a very familiar type of genre for me. It's a genre that is, it's an oral genre, and it makes a transition to a page a bit uneasily, you might say, because when you're telling an anecdote, you can support it with a performance. And your knowledge of the audience is often quite intimate if you're relating an anecdote to somebody who you know in person. It's an intimate space, and you can create intimacy quickly if you're familiar with the telling of certain kinds of anecdotes. And in all my books, anecdote is sort of an important unit of meaning, because there are just so many funny little stories that I collect and love in the same way that, if you find a grocery list, you might have a found poem in it, or graffiti is another thing that I often regard as a source for found poetry. And certainly, different speakers who are, overheard conversation and party conversation and all kinds of things end up in my poems. And I think that's common enough. And there's a certain kind of faithfulness to that I want to work with and through. For in singing, the different kinds of voices, part of how they ended up the way they did is that they have different kinds of sources, and the consistency of those sources mobilizes some of the pressures in the narrative, or allegorizes the pressures in the narrative. So just to give it a couple of examples, one of the sort of registers of that text is psychiatric records about one of the characters. So those psychiatric records, those snippets can appear scattered all through different parts of the book, and they have their own sort of sections as well. And it's very important, I think, for the story that they speak with a certain kind of authority, and that we also are given reason to doubt that authority and doubt its sort of claims to truth and so on. So there's another version of the story that gets recited verbally and recorded by the main character's friend. And it's how this friend recalls the main character's story as he has told it on his hitchhiking trips around North America to all these different people. That version, we also get reasons to doubt different kinds of things. But I think that the comparing the reasons that we have to doubt is a big part of how we evaluate and understand those voices. It's the language, the tone, the idiom takes on its own function in authority in a way that I think is made quite transparent by that structure, or that I hope is, not in the sense that it gives an easy access to meaning, but actually in the sense that you really notice, it really draws attention to the artificiality of how we experience authority in language.
I really love that you pointed out a few things that I wanted to bring up already in your little speech there. So first off, the idea of the psychiatric dialogue within the book, I think, is really important to the text, especially in the characterization of John, the character, in the way that it's making it very clear that John understands that he's both a vehicle for critique, as he's going to say what he wants about the world, but then he's also the object of critique. He's being observed and looked at and scrutinized in a way that is uncontrollable by him, which makes him feel kind of helpless, I think. And you really kind of get that with that interjection, those psychiatric interjections, which are very clearly authoritative, but the text makes you doubt it. But then later on, we see that same sort of composition. I think it's on, let's see here, it's page 72. It's more that sort of dialogue with Simon, where there's these two columns, and one column is kind of John's thoughts, and the other one is Simon's story, and then there's also these other little bits interjected in between it. And it really made me think about how these traumatic events that we have in our lives, they're not always just what you remember. It's all these other pieces that you're pulling in, and you're saying, like, the story isn't quite just what you remember. It's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of what your friends tell, kind of mythologizing your friend's life a little bit. And so I really liked how all the formal bits connected with that sort of characterization of John, the way that the experimental parts aren't just there to be, flashy.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, there definitely, there is a plan with the experiment. And of course, I'd be delighted to be flashy, but not just flashy would also be good. I want them to, I want them to do what they are. I want them to be what they do. I want them to do what they claim. Yeah, I think that's really great, because there's, things that are true, right? Things that are true narratives of events. There's still, the closer you get in, there's more than one kind of truth, because that can be important and that can be powerful. Because certainly, the irony with those two columns is that Simon's narrative of John is quite idealized. He's made a bit more heroic than John really is, in that moment. But the fact that that's what Simon thinks of him can become food for thought for John, can become a topic for reflection for him those years later. And in a way, it can become as true as what really happened. And the irony doesn't undermine it. It just contributes some layers, shall we say, and the whole thing sort of forms layers because the stories they stack and they accumulate rather than disperse, because we also, I mean, we might doubt the veracity or question the authority of the psychiatric records, but we don't question the power that they have in determining a person's life, because authority, medical authority, and the authority of the police and so on can operate on a person's life in very powerful ways, and those stories become true in the sense that you have to continue to contend with them, even if they're not meaningfully true to the person that they're about.
Yeah, and that confrontation with authority is something that really rings throughout the book, whether it's John's confrontations with his teachers or administrators, the school, that the fight with the police, the sort of the doubt and even animosity towards the doctors that are just really trying to help. But I also kind of understand that that confrontation, the feeling left out, the feeling alienated. The book seems to be interrogating the systems of care as much as the systems of self, right? And at the end, there was a really nice moment where John realizes that he has all these cigarettes that his friends have given him. And there's this feeling for the reader, at least, you kind of know that he's probably going to be okay. And he's already realized that he's a little bit absurd, but maybe likes that a little bit too much. But I think he's going to be okay. But do you still think that he's going to be anti-authority? I kind of left that a little bit unsure. I was unsure about that. I just want to pass that on to you. But can he still be so anti-authority when he actually realizes that he has more people helping him than not?
Yeah, the nurse figure is supposed to, I think, or I sort of imagine that the nurse figure, Carmen, sort of embodies that that tension a bit, where it's evident that that character is genuine, has John's best interests at heart. He accepts it completely. I think that for John, authority is going to remain something to be strategically outmaneuvered, in the sense that the care that John's friends have for him and the cigarettes that they get him, that's an expression of personal care. And individuals who are in those systems of authority can also be personally caring and virtuous, and their roles don't have to prevent them from expressing that. They also don't require them to express that. Care and friendship are things that I don't think they can be meaningfully institutionalized, but I think that institutions work more or less well to deliver those things, to obstruct those things. They have a relationship that's it's superior to care in the sense that it can direct it and misdirect it, and it's controlling of the distribution of care. So I think that one of the key things with John is sort of recognizing that poverty is stigmatized, and if you have an impoverished background, you carry a stigmatized identity. Now, there's all kinds of passing privilege that can be afforded to a person if that's something that they are able to transcend through education or through money or other things that happen for them. But John, of course, is he's uncomfortably on the edge of childhood and adulthood, because he's adult enough to be held responsible, but he is still a child in the sense that he has very little control over his own material conditions, material situation. So I'm getting a little bit out in the weeds, I think, but what I want to say about John's relationship to authority is that what I hope that he will do is gain insight about managing authority strategically, which is what we all have to do. And it doesn't have to be a cold, miserable thing. It can be productive, but it's also not guaranteed to be.
Yeah, managing your relationship with authority. That's a good way to put it. You're always kind of, I think, negotiating that, how far you're willing to push it or willing to take it, I guess. It feels the same way, I think, as poets that lean towards the avant-garde and the experimental, how closely we align with the lyric, or the sort of direct spoken, what might be called the workshop poem, or whether we engage with more long form or found style poetics. I mean, I'm making a kind of false dichotomy here to kind of make a point, because I don't think it's so clear cut, as kind of your work suggests, for sure. So, like, how do you make that relation between the lyric, about trying to say something that's meaningful to you and maybe others, and that sort of post-lyric disembodied voice that you tend to write with?
Yeah. I really, I do see a lot of the sort of bag of tricks of the avant-gardes. And I think, for me, there are a number of avant-gardes that are really important to me. And I sort of view the various avant-garde isms as all being, I could really get carried away here, because for me, and not necessarily for everyone or in any authoritative critical sense, a lot of avant-gardisms are about clowning, which sounds like a funny thing to say, but clowning, to me, I take it back to its etymological sense, which is through an old German word, which in English we have a cognate word, clod, a lump of dirt, and this is part of where we get clown from. The idea that we have a country person whose manners are unformed. But when we think of clowning, of course, we think of hijinks. The kind of clowning that I have in mind in particular when I think of it is sort of a rural figure who deploys various strategies related to, or that might seem to riff on a kind of Socratic ignorance. So ironizing things, ironizing common sense, pointing to the absence of the reality that's represented. So to take all that back in a more direct way, I have to be avant-garde in the face of the lyric, because the things that it does, the things that the conventional lyric does with voice, would like to be accepted as natural, common sense, obvious. I'm one person, I have one voice, I speak in this way about myself, I have a relatively consistent experience, the sun rises and sets every day, and so on. But to me, when we encounter that on the page, one of the first things that's really obvious about it is all the trickery that goes into it, all the work that it takes, all the different kinds of games and tricks and temptations for the reader that are necessary, the seduction of the reader that's necessary to create the illusion of a coherent speaking I. Now, I might very well have an organic personal experience of a coherent speaking I, but when I start to write that, I have to also recognize, how bogus it is. And at the same time, the ways that I work through that bogus way that the self is constructed and represented are also a joke. They're a serious joke. It's impossible to me to think about the ridiculousness of the voice, of the self, of even just the conditions of narrative, without also seeing that there's something good and true, and to me, very organic feeling about them. So these things, they don't stay stably like, well, this is serious, this is a joke. it's all based in superstructure or anything like that. It's never that clear, you know. I don't think, and I really embrace that. You know, so I guess the different kinds of strategies that I mobilize in one text or another text might draw on different historical avant-gardes because they relate to strategic decisions around what particular conventions I want to make fun of, make look ridiculous, parade in their artificiality or whatever, or which things I also just want to connect. You know, I want to connect with the reader because you know, we voluntarily enter this illusion together of being able to speak and having a consistent self and assigning a name to the face, so to speak. And I think that play of illusions has an inherent value and meaning. And I hope that my work explores that and adds something to that.
So has your promise, I guess, to the reader changed with this pivot to fiction, away from, you know, or maybe away from a more obvious poetry and towards something that's has, I mean, if you call it fiction, you call it a novel, it's assumed that there's some kind of narrative. So like, is there something changing in that pivot, or was it just like some other decision that made you take up fiction?
Yeah, you know, I always, you know, to me, like fiction is more of a challenge and a provocation than anything. And you know, I use like I hope that my sort of promises to the reader are never taken at face value. If I refer to it as a novella or a novel or you know, or a long poem, or I've thought about it quite extensively as a rhizome, in the sense that Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari might use that word. That, you know, this particular text I see as being basically contiguous with my other work. It's always a dare to me when I speak something, when I write something true in a book, because there are always you know, elements of things in all my work, in my poems too, that are true or that are not true in a literal sense. And I want the reader to think about it and maybe even worry about it a little. And I feel like the kind of intimacy that is generated, also an illusion, by a reader coming to the conclusions, picking up the cues and the clues, or even just taking the risk and the dare and coming to the conclusions that I might like them to about what's true, it is a kind of payoff for the reader, or I'm trying to plan things that way, that if they can go with it where I'm going and believe the parts that I want them to believe, that the stakes will appear in the correct scope or scale.
It seems to me, at least with the most recent book, in Singing, you're almost daring the reader to believe or misbelieve you with some of the choices you made. Pictures and maybe personal facts or personal details. I liked that that there's that challenge, right? That serious joke where you're kind of almost poking fun of the experimental novel by bringing in maybe some auto theory or what have you, and then not explaining it at all, you know, just kind of letting the reader figure it out, which is very much I think the technique of your poetry is you structure it and then allow the reader to find themselves in on the joke at some point.
Well, I hope so. I do hope so, because it's definitely, to me, this is not cold stuff, in the sense that, you know, I think about some authors who are very challenging or very provocative, and if you make the wrong move, you know, you've lost in their eyes. I love Vladimir Nabokov, and he is like very, very, he has a reputation for being cruel, and I think it's very well earned. I love his work. I think he's hilarious, priceless, brilliant, but his work is often a dare to people. It's a dare to contend with him and fail. I don't really see my work that way at all. It's more like it's supposed to be a challenge, but it's essentially good natured. I think probably a lot of my own personal sense of humor comes from the style of my grandfather growing up. It would be very hard to get across his style now in the context of this conversation, but it was definitely like the highest, whatever was the sort of highest pitch of teasing that he thought you would emotionally survive. And he mellowed out as he got older. And I think my touch is a little gentler than him, than his at least was then. Although it's definitely in that same spirit. It's kind of like I think of it as just sort of a kind of a skeptical stance, like I sort of am standing back saying, oh really, and taking a properly critical perspective on things, and I want the reader to do likewise. So of course I engage in pulling their leg a little bit and this kind of thing, but more just kind of like just push and sort of demand. And of course, then the risk of that for me is that people will find that it's not worth the effort.
I know what you mean with the temperament, the grandfather temperament. That was certainly my grandfather as well. My dad a little bit too, although he had to tone it down. I think the generations tone it down.
I think they do. Yeah, I kind of skipped one because I grew up without a dad, but very, very close to my mom's father, and which is the grandpa that I'm mentioning. And I think of him as being tough as nails, really tough as nails, from a quite hard-bitten rural background. But actually, I think about him saying that his father was so tough that he couldn't even imagine being as tough as his father. Just like, I didn't meet that guy, but kind of maybe for the best. Of course, he was a World War I vet, and I think they had to be tough. Oh, he's quite seriously wounded at Arras, at the Somme.
That's going back. That's going back the years.
It's going back. It's all there, though. It's all there, Jeff.
That sort of idea of time and memory is something that you play a lot with in your work as well. And like the voices, you don't seem to give any sort of indication to these time shifts. And I like that because it's disorienting in the good way, that you just let the syntax take you along the journey. And I think that was most evident in the chapbook you sent me, Grew and Bleam Pourings. It's very long. Is that a newer work or older work?
Oh, I think I wrote most of that in 2016 and 17.
Yeah, just the nature of it, the seriality of it, numbered sections and no punctuation, and just this kind of rolling onslaught of lines. It really disassociates the reader from the flow of time in the way that I think probably the best poetry pulls you out of your time and allows you to sit outside of time, maybe even. But there's this one section, and I'll read it here, and then we can kind of finish up with this question. I think it's a good one to end on. There's a section, I think section 3, and it says, when that else of life overwhelms writing, do you lose those poems, or are they stored somewhere for your return to writing in some form? Does the loss of poems accumulate as antimatter writing with its own invisible gravity, calculable as mass of unwritten time? How do you deal with time in your poetry? Is it the same in a poem as in a human experiencing temporality, or is there some gap? There's a passage in Flood Basement, I think it was, that said the record is a record of musicians now absent. And is that like the poem? Is the poem a record of the poet now absent?
Yeah, I think that's terrific. What a rich line of questioning, and thank you for that. Definitely, I have a sense of a lot of the pleasure that I have taken in reading poetry and certainly listening to recordings is having access to absent time of a kind. And there's a layering of time there. And of course, all events represent layerings of time because, of course, I'm sitting at a desk that someone made, right? And it's made out of wood that is from trees that grew up over a certain length of time and a length of place, or in a place, I should say. And the soil that produced them, of course, in this part of North America, I think it's 12,000 years for 16 inches of topsoil. So, I mean, the desk is ancient, the matter that makes up our bodies is ancient, and so on. I think that we all sort of, swim in incalculable layers of time. A lot of what writing has been for me is a desire to preserve and to save things, and also a recognition that that's impossible. So, it's kind of like audio recordings, of course. And I know you've done some of those in the context of music, as I have also. Of course, it doesn't sound like it sounded in person, and that's completely impossible. It will never sound like it sounded in person. And not only will it not sound like it, it won't be like it. So the limitations of language, of my own ability to write, of any sort of recording or archive are they just sort of recapitulate the pain of the passing away of the moment, and yet we want them too. And photographs do this too. That we're trying to preserve something that's slipping away, whether because we want to save it and keep it and relive it, or because we don't want to lose track of it because we think it's important in some way, even if it's not pleasurable. But all we can really do is rehearse and rehearse and rehearse the loss. Now, in that passage that you read, what I'm meditating on, there is thinking about the process of writing and how important it is to me in the rhythm of writing in my daily life and how important it's become. So I have been journal keeping in a pretty consistent way for about 20 years, just over 20 years. And it's a completely different way of experiencing time. And the other thing that I've noticed is that, from when I was a teenager to now, audio recording technology has completely changed, because now you can get a device like a Zoom H4n, if anyone knows what that is, which allows you to make a pretty good recording of a rock band in jam space now, and it's not expensive. It's I think they're still about $300 or something. But I would have been, yes. Here's mine over here in its case. And it's like, if I had had that as a kid, oh man, I would have recorded so much stuff, and I would have huge volumes of archives to swim through now. As it is, I really have a huge amount of archival material. But if I depart, and in the passage you cite, if I depart from the rhythm of writing, then I'm wondering, like, where does that stuff go? And of course, the joke of all that is it goes nowhere. It's just gone. But is it gone? I mean, it's also there all the time. It's the same place it ever was. Writing isn't saving it. So it's kind of laughing, I hope, fairly gently at myself, and this desire to save something and keep something that you can't keep. Yeah, and even like, we have poetry in English, of course, going back to hundreds and hundreds of years, and a huge amount of poetry for 300 years, and more than I'll ever read, more than anyone living will ever read, of course. But yet it still seems that more has been lost than saved somehow.
All the notebooks that were thrown out in the trash or rotted in the basement, along with the analog tapes made on the 8-tracks when we didn't have the H4n to digitally store everything.
Right. And also just, you know, oh, I'm trying to remember who it is now. Is it Stephen Jay Gould, who talks about being less fascinated? I'm paraphrasing, but it's something about being less fascinated by the genius of Einstein than the knowledge that as much genius and more has perished, you know, slaving away in the cotton fields. And of course, this is true, that the majority of human brilliance over time and at this moment has been wasted. We don't have the fruit of it. Anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. And it's sad. It's incredibly painful, and there's nothing we can do about it. Or is there? Or is there?
Well, it seems that your daily practice is an attempt to do something.
Yes, it's a refusal. It's a privileged refusal on my part to be totally erased. And of course, you know, time and chance happen to them all. And I'm sure that in the you know, on a geologic scale, everything I create will be erased as well. And that, you know, so what is it? What is it about that gesture that sort of maintains its charm? Some kind of impossible hope, a willfully naive hope, which I think that phrase might encapsulate what I hope that people would experience. And maybe here's a willfully naive hope on the top of another one, that they would experience that as the sweetness and the general sentiment of my work. That, you know, in the face of, you know, the sort of overwhelming nihilism that life imposes on us, the despair that is sort of waiting for us in every moment, that we could maintain somehow and protect a willfully naive hope.
And that's a wonderful moment and note, I think, to finish on. Thanks for talking with me today about your work, in enlivening and certainly enlightening conversation about your techniques and about some of the things that inform your poetry and this new book. In singing, he composed a song, from the University of Calgary Press, who have been really putting out some great work over the past few years, I've noticed. Work from Gil McElroy, from Amy LeBlanc, and from Jeremy Stewart now as well. So,
well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for your generous and I think quite brilliant questions and the opportunity to speak about my work. It's wonderful, and to have an opportunity like this. So thank you. And actually, I think as long as we're here, I'll just take this moment to thank Professor John Shad and everyone at the Lancaster University Department of English Literature and Creative Writing for their encouragement and for hosting this on the YouTube channel. So yes, thank you.